Hello, guys. Today, sadly, we will be talking about the Peavey decade and why it is now just dumb. So, if you don't know about the Peavey decade, you probably think I'm just rude for some reason. What's wrong with this amp? You're just being rude. But if you know about the Peavey decade, you probably know exactly what I'm getting on about. So, a quick little history of the Peavey decade. I have the audio fanzine up here. It's a little 10-watt amp. It's got an 8-inch speaker. It's got two inputs, one for normal, one for saturation, pre-gain, post-gain, and then you kind of can't see it, but it's got a low, mid, and high EQ, and then it's got the decade. It's this little amp thingy. So on Audio Fanzine, it lists $36.67 as the average used price. And that is right on the money in 2019, pre what Josh Homme did. So if you don't know who Josh Homme is, then whatever, who cares? But I will get to that in a second. So again, pre Josh Homme, I have the Peavey Decade on Wayback Machine in around 2019, and I think this is like German or like something, some other language other than English, so I can't really read it. But if you look, Peavey Decade amp, $75 plus $50 shipping. Another Peavey Decade amp, $59 plus $78 shipping. And it does line up with what prices we're going for at this time. So, okay, it's a little $75 amp. What's the big deal? Well, Josh Homme, as previously mentioned, went on a Apple TV Plus show, I believe, with Mark Ronson, and decided to specifically shout out the Peavey Decade. So after specifically shouting out the Peavey Decade, the clip got re-uploaded to YouTube and got 140,000 views. So with the Peavey Decade being specifically shouted out by Josh Homme, people decide to flock to Reverb and list theirs for exorbitant amounts of money, and you'd think, okay, people are just riding the hype train. No one's actually buying it for $500, right? Well, let's check the Reverb graph. So here we are at the Reverb graph. If you can look closely, I'm not a scientist or anything, but I think you can guess about the time that Josh Homme shouted out the Peavey Decade amp. I believe it's around June to October of 2021. So the price jumped very literally tenfold and peaked at 500. But if you look at the sold price, they only actually sell for about 200 to 400 bucks. So, I know what you're thinking. Okay, the Peavey Decade is just a Peavey practice amp. Is there anything similar to it? Yes, there is. There is the Peavey Solo, a very similar Peavey practice amp with an EQ. There is the Peavey Rage, a very similar practice amp with gain and EQ. And then this one is the kicker, the Peavey Audition, which has literally the same gain and EQ as the Peavey Decade with a very slightly different speaker. All three of these alternatives go for around 75 to 90 bucks, 5 times cheaper than the Peavey Decade, and people still won't pay that for a almost exactly the same amp. So I feel like the takeaway from this should have been maybe Peaveys are a little bit underrated. Maybe get a Peavey in your collection, since Josh Homme's shouting out a Peavey that you wouldn't expect to be good. But the takeaway in reality was the Peavey Decade is magical, and I need a Peavey Decade for my guitar to sound any good. So I just think that this is just interesting. I don't think anyone who buys a Peavey Decade is going to get ripped off because it's quite obviously what they're buying, but I just feel like this is just a very strange situation to just exist. What's even more annoying is that I owned a Peavey Decade and sold it. I bought a Peavey Decade for $5 at a Goodwill and sold it to, I think, Music Around for $40. And I was like, heck yeah, I made 35 bucks. I'm entrepreneur. Give me that cash. So I even have a picture right here. Look, there's my cat. There's my Yamaha PSR6. And then in the background, Peavey Decade. But I just feel like it's unfortunate that this whole situation has turned into Peavey Decade is magical instead of what really I feel like Josh Homme might have been going for is like, Peaveys are cool. Don't just like, some people like Marshall, some people like Roland amps. Maybe try Peavey. Not that Peavey is some underground company, but maybe Peaveys are kind of neat. So yeah, I just feel like this whole situation is just strange. Hopefully you get the same vibes as me. Hopefully you're not watching this video and going onto Reverb looking for a $400 PV. And hopefully actually you are now educated and smart and maybe buy a PV Audition 20 instead and save the extra 350 freaking dollars for and get nearly the same thing. So, yeah, hopefully you enjoyed my little not rant, but just confusion as to why.